All right, ready for a deep dive. Today, we're going straight to the heart. Literally, we're tackling the Frank-Starling Law.
Oh, yeah, this one's a classic.
It's all about how our hearts, manage to pump all those different amounts of blood. Like, think about it. How does it know how much to pump when you're just chilling versus when you're sprinting for the bus?
Exactly. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And to break it all down, we've got this awesome scientific article. It's called, let me see, Physiology, Frank-Starling Law, straight from the PERLS medical database.
Perfect. So are we talking like the basics of the heart here, or are we going deeper?
Oh, going deep. We're going to uncover those little nuances of this law that make it so important.
Okay, love it. So the heart pumps blood. Yeah, basic stuff, but how does it actually know how much to pump at any given time? What's the signal?
Well, that's where the Frank-Starling Law comes in. It's all about the relationship between, get this, the stretching of your heart muscle and the force of its contractions.
Okay, hold on. Back up a sec. Stretching, like a rubber band.
Yeah, kinda. Imagine those tiny muscle fibers in your heart. They're called sarcomeres. And as they stretch, they store energy. Like, picture that rubber band getting pulled back. The more it stretches, the more forcefully it snaps back, right?
Right.
The heart muscle works kind of similarly.
So my heart is a super-powered rubber band.
In a way, yeah. But there's a limit, right? Like, you can only stretch a rubber band so far before it breaks.
Yeah, that's true. So is there like a limit to how much the heart can stretch to? What happens if it goes too far?
You're on the right track. There's definitely an optimal stretch point for those sarcomeres. Too little, and you don't get a strong enough contraction. Too much, and you risk damaging those muscle fibers.
I see. So it's about hitting that sweet spot. But how does this actually play out, in real life?
Okay, so picture this. You're on the treadmill, working up a sweat. Your muscles are screaming for oxygen, right?
I've only been there.
Well, your heart's got to deliver. So it starts beating faster, filling up with more blood. This extra volume stretches the heart muscle, and boom, a more powerful contraction to get that oxygen where it needs to go.
Whoa, so my heart is like adapting in real time to my workout. That's wild. But hold on, how do we actually measure this relationship, the stretch and the force? Like, can we see it?
You bet. We have the Frank-Starling curve. It's like a graph that shows you your heart's performance. On one side, you've got the volume of blood in the ventricle, what we call preload, and on the other, the amount of blood pumped out with each beat. That's the stroke volume.
Okay, so the more blood in, the stronger the pump out, up to a point, I guess. But is this curve like the same for everyone, or can it change?
Good question. And that's where things get really interesting. The Frank-Starling curve isn't fixed. It can shift. A healthy heart's going to have a steeper curve, showing how well it responds to changes in blood volume. But a weaker heart, say, one that's been through some damage, might have a flatter curve.
So the curve's like a report card for your heart.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Now, remember we talked about norepinephrine earlier?
Vaguely. Remind me.
That's that stress hormone. Well, it's like a turbo boost for your heart. It kicks in during stressful situations, making your heart rate and contraction force go up. Basically, it shifts the whole Frank-Starling curve upward.
Wow, so even stress affects this curve. It's all connected. I'm guessing other things can shift it too, like exercise or medications.
Spot on. This curve is super dynamic. Regular exercise can actually reshape your heart, leading to a better, more efficient curve over time. And yep, certain medications can definitely mess with the curve too, either making the heart contract stronger or weaker.
This is fascinating stuff. So we've got this curve that's like a live feed of how our hearts are doing, changing with stress, exercise, even meds. But what happens when things go wrong? Like, what role does the Frank-Starling Law have in a heart that's not working at its best?
That's the big question, and that's where we'll pick up next time. We'll dive into how this mechanism can be both a hero and a bit of a problem when the heart is under pressure.
Oh, you've got me hooked. Can't wait to hear more about what happens when things get tricky for the heart. We'll be back with more soon, so stick around. Back again. Still diving deep into this Frank-Starling Law and what it means for our hearts. Before, we were talking about how this law, controls that link between stretching and the force of the heart's contractions, but I'm really curious about what happens when things aren't running smoothly.
Right, because this whole mechanism, it's pretty amazing how it adapts, but it's not a cure-all, It has its limits, especially when we start talking about stuff like heart failure.
So let's talk about that. Heart failure, we mentioned it earlier, but how does the Frank-Starling thing, how does that even factor in when the heart's having trouble?
Well, imagine a heart that's kind of worn out. Maybe it's been damaged from a heart attack or maybe high blood pressure for a long time. It's just not pumping as well as it used to. So the body has to rely on that Frank-Starling mechanism to pick up the slack.
So the heart just stretches more, tries to keep up the same output, even though it's weaker. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Think of it like trying to run uphill when you're already exhausted. You might be able to push for a bit, but you're going to hit a wall eventually. The heart's the same way. It can only stretch so much before it starts to backfire.
Yeah, that makes sense. But wouldn't that constant stretching, wouldn't that make the heart muscle even weaker? Doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose?
The thing, it's a bit of a trade-off. At first, that extra stretch does help keep the blood flowing, which is crucial. It gives the body some time to adjust and for treatments to kick in. But if it goes on too long, this overstretching, it can actually change the structure of the heart, making it less efficient in the long run.
Ah, so it's like a temporary fix, but not a long-term solution.
You got it. And that's why understanding this whole Frank-Starling law, it's so important for treatment. Doctors can use that knowledge to come up with strategies that help the heart without pushing that Frank-Starling mechanism too hard.
Makes sense. So how does this translate to, actual treatment options? What can doctors do to help a heart that's struggling?
Well, the article talks about a few key approaches. One is using inotropic drugs, like digoxin, for example.
Wait, inotropic, refresh my memory. What does that even mean?
Oh, right. Inotropic just means anything that affects how strongly a muscle contracts. So these drugs, they basically help the heart squeeze harder with each beat.
So they give it a boost, like extra muscle power.
Exactly. Then there are diuretics. Those help get rid of extra fluid in the body. That way, there's less strain on the heart because it doesn't have to work as hard to pump against all that volume.
And we can't forget about vasodilators. Those widen the blood vessels, right?
Right.
Make it easier for the heart to pump.
Yeah, that's the one. Like, imagine widening a road to ease traffic. Less resistance means the heart can pump more efficiently.
Gotcha. So it's like a multi-pronged attack, making the heart stronger, reducing fluid buildup, and easing the pressure.
You nailed it. And often, doctors will use a combination of these treatments to manage heart failure. Find the right balance to support the heart without pushing it too far.
This is all making sense now. But the article did mention that even with all these treatments, a damaged heart might never be as good as new. That's kind of, I don't know, a little bit of a downer, right?
Yeah, it's true. But it also shows how complex the heart is and how even medicine has its limits. We can do a lot to help manage heart failure and improve people's lives, but we can't always fully reverse the damage.
Right, of course. So we've been talking a lot about heart failure, but I mean, the Frank-Starling law, it's got to be working in a healthy heart too, right? Not just when things are going wrong.
Absolutely. In a healthy heart, this mechanism is constantly fine-tuning things, making sure the heart's pumping the right amount of blood to keep up with whatever the body needs.
So even as we're sitting here, the Frank-Starling law is at work, keeping our hearts ticking. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. But I am curious, what about in a specific condition like dilated cardiomyopathy? We touched on that before. What happens then?
Good point. Dilated cardiomyopathy, that's where the chambers of the heart get bigger and the walls thin out, making it harder to pump. And guess what? The Frank-Starling mechanism, it plays a big part in how that condition develops.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more.
Well, as those heart chambers stretch out, the muscle fibers, they have to stretch further too, just to try and keep the blood flowing. And at first, that does help compensate for the weaker heart muscle. But here's the thing. As the condition progresses, as those heart chambers stretch, and those muscle fibers are stretching further and further, the heart's trying, right? It's trying to keep the blood moving. It's relying on that Frank-Starling mechanism. But after a while, all that stretching, it can actually make things worse.
So it's like it's trying to help, but it's actually hurting itself in the process.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in. Think about it like stretching out a rubber band. You stretch it too far too many times, it loses its snap. It can't bounce back like it used to.
Right, it gets all loose and floppy.
Exactly. And in dilated cardiomyopathy, that overstretching can make the heart muscle even weaker, less able to pump blood effectively.
That's a great way to explain it. It really shows how that Frank-Starling mechanism, it can be helpful, but it's not a perfect solution.
Definitely not. It's like a reminder that our bodies are amazing, they can adapt to a lot, but there are limits.
Right, it's not a magic fix. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key things you want our listeners to remember about the Frank-Starling law and, what it means for their heart health?
Okay, well, first off, remember this law. It's like the foundation of how the heart adjusts its pumping power based on how much blood it's getting. It's happening all the time, even when your heart's healthy, just making sure everything's running smoothly.
Yeah, like a built-in control system, making sure the heart's doing its job.
That's it. Now, the second thing to remember, this mechanism, it's awesome, but it can only handle so much. In those tricky situations, like heart failure or dilated cardiomyopathy, pushing the Frank-Starling mechanism too far can actually lead to more problems.
So the heart's tough, but it's not indestructible, right?
Exactly. And I guess the most important takeaway is this. Understanding this law, the Frank-Starling Law, all the ins and outs, it gives us the power to make smart choices about our hearts.
So things like exercising regularly, eating healthy, going to the doctor when you need to.
Exactly. We can all do our part to support our hearts.
Love it. Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive into the Frank-Starling Law. We've covered a lot of ground, from the nitty-gritty science to some serious health conditions, but ultimately it all comes back to taking care of our hearts, right?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Knowing how our bodies work, especially the heart, it's empowering. It helps us make healthier choices.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, stay curious, keep learning, and listen to your heart. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.